Janju Baru Dagi Gasuchi, Nagi Chanyan Gipe Chokam, Golam Hansu Sangay Tupa So. No, Janju Baru Dagi Gasuchi, Nagi Chanyan Gipe Chokam, Golam Hansu Sangay Tupa So. Sodan Joki Chonam Law, Janju Baru Dagi Gasuchi, Nagi Chanyan Gipe Chokam, Golam Hansu Sangay Tupa So.
Dayantan, Gate,
Gate para, Song Gate Body,
Dayantan,
Gate para, Song Gate Body,
Dayantan,
Gate para, Song Gate Body,
all of that. Simja Tamjaka to Tobjalana Machiba Sanjay Kumar was a Chinaya Tobacha. Teacher the Anime Gasa Chobana Tushi, North Langore, Langore, Shigore, Shiver, Togo, Tora Toji Shumano, what Kodu, and comes Baba the Takanja, Gazachamushuala, Seba Chuju, Tena Tesha Tibin Yes, the Kombacha.
So we must we determine actually to do whatever we possibly can to attain the pure state of enlightenment in order to benefit all living beings. In order to do this, we have to have a good understanding of what those trainings are. Therefore, we need to study those trainings, and we need to study from an unmistaken source. And so it is with this in mind this morning that we are able to listen to teaching from just such a source, the Bodhisattva's Way of Life by Master Shantideva.
All of sudden, Takajan Namjun Nation, Rangi Dun Nankala, and a Tabjala to the Tomba, or a Jessa Lamani, but number Tabjala to the Tomba Shaja to Bataka, Shaja Yon so much. Uncle children who make a torture so. What to do the Tamba? Yes, and the Indian Chagatan to the conclusion, Kula children who make a torture so. But what's about a year since I wanted to Kumbacha?
And as normal, also, we set up our merit field in the space in front. In actual fact, our root guru, in aspect, the greatly compassionate and one skillful in means, Shakyamuni Buddha, who has one face and two hands, with the right hand in the earth-touching mudra, and the left hand in the meditative equipoise mudra, holding an alms bowl filled with nectar, and to have that certainty that the Buddha is actually there in the space in front of us.
What did it and then what the said, and Ranga Tawa, the Tinchip, and my king, Simja Touch, and you said the Pamana, Mason never you, so George was Simja and the Mason never you, such the Juga Simja that Tanjaya, the Jusus to win Nashima Kanshila, and it number two on the Kusun to be undead, and then Naratu Nashicha, that Namju didn't show. What did you Kubashe?
And also that we visualize in the space all around us are all kind, mother, sentient beings, beginning with our own parents and moving out from that to include all the all the beings, the 6 realms of existence. And though they are suffering, the sufferings relative to those realms, they are perceiving it with the human consciousness, and they are thus able to appreciate, for example, when looking towards the visualization of the Buddha, the appreciation of the Buddha's qualities of body, speech, and mind, etc.
And then the Tumbegi, the Ranger, Caso the Takaji, Dula said that Tumbati and the Jew or Jamba took our homes, what the Yigi Sunjis, Kobashe, and it the nigger took our hole was a part of member to the Shindan January, Shiba, only the Jaba Gentle, Ishiba combated to run, Tobashaja to be number gentle tip, and only on Gochilla Machizo never let, and we give a weekend. What did you Kobashe?
And then to turn our attention back to the figure that we are visualizing in the space in front, the Buddha who is marked at the crown by an Om, at the throat by an A, and at the heart by a Hum syllable. From that Hum syllable at the heart, countless rays of light emanate, going out into the pure realms and inviting back the wisdom beings and empowering deities. The wisdom beings dissolve into the central figure. The empowering deities confer the nectar of empowerment, the sum of which overflows at the crown, producing the figure of Akshobhya.
가서다 라지바 탐절을 저와 시험을 집어 탈락해와 꿀을 태우지 집어 니름을 맞춰봐 펜다마다 된 저기보다 더 매윤데 고승두고 윤대디가 좀 받잖아 아니 또 받대 아니 당분의 상계 좀 받은 가라든 신체 치와 군대 인데 그렇지 아니 되네 다 같이 가서다 다 같이 람버 아니 되네 다 같이 심지가 또 투게 람라랍 안타를 접은 것도 쟤는 다 어디를 심바죠 오 공부하시네 아니 어디가 다 되게 윤대 전시be 가네 아니 되게 고소도 윤대 좀 다외도 와 이시게도 홍문도 그때 봤는데 제가 삼부터 아니 심지가 동네에 나줄 고아지다 제자가 동네에 나줄 저 아니 배 가서도 녀바니네 아니 대달라 아니 동네다 나와라 미스베 니제 대화된 그 잡아 어떻게 가서 강투도게 아니 세메시 로라 게답제네 아니 대 동네도 잡았다 딱이 지게 동네 탐자도 잡아 아니 교대 잡아 딱이 지게 대다 챘는 것이 대다 챘는 것도 맞투게 오고 라마 투게 오고 지게 랍도스 대다 대화 탐자했던 거데 아니 딱이 지게 대다 챘는 것이 챘는 것도 라마 투게 오고 지게 랍도스 저 어때 공부시
So then, from our point of view, in focusing on the figure of the Buddha out in the space in front, we really bring to mind again, recall the amazing qualities of the Buddha's body, speech, and mind, and what are the defining characteristics of an enlightened being, and that they are expert in preventing any suffering with regard to themselves. They are expert in preventing suffering for others. And they work with great compassion and without any bias for the benefit of all, and they work to benefit all regardless of whether any benefit is returned to them. And so we also understand that the Buddha did not begin as an enlightened being, but started out just like us, under the influence of mental afflictions, but then having generated that mind of enlightenment, trained on the path with that motivation, again attained the peerless state of full and complete enlightenment. And for that, we generated the clear faith, the faith of conviction, and the faith of manifest faith in relation to the appreciation of these qualities. When we bring our mind to focus on all sentient beings around us, it's suffering that comes to mind. It's this feeling of being unable to bear this suffering. Brings forth or induces the notion of compassion, and that we, in the context of the four immeasurables, we say how wonderful it would be if all sentient beings were free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May that be the case. I will be the one to see that this is so. Oh, Guru Manindra, please bless me to make this so. Likewise, the desire for happiness, that is love. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings had happiness and the cause of happiness. May this be the case. I will see to it that it is so. Oh, Guru Manindra, please bless me to make this so.
근데 공부시했잖아. 아니 소소 무슨 지가 주도 다 제모도 못 세우지. 아니 근데 다 심적도 아니 다 좀바지 제도가 나가 가져 심적이 감다 매버 발은여 왔지다. 와시다 맞게 와이나. 아니 다 감바 제도에 다 매대 버려. 매대도. 근데 이거 인자 아니 저 감다 매버 나서 바지 켜 셰바이나 아니 계지르르데 아니 가서 두자 규민바 민바 좋아 제도에. 아니 심적이 돌아 마주가 싸워지는 연구요 말이야. 낭제 그거 심지어 돈을 주고 찾는 거래. 근데 이번 인사 왔다 산제 공부하는 마음으로 타면도 너 토바치기 인스. 왔다 어디를 공부시했잖아. 토바치기 아니 뒤에도 다 가져 준주고 중대다. 퇴선 공수치기 인스도 어디를 아니 왔다 되게 가서 전시면은 왔다 공부시했지 어디를
So we make these vows and these aspirations, but we realize that from our own self, our own point of view, we don't have at the moment that capacity to really benefit very many people, not even, certainly not all sentient beings. It's only from that point of view of enlightenment, of having full and complete enlightenment, that one has the understanding, and not just of the needs of all sentient beings, but all the particular dispositions, personalities, the karmas, and so on. and how that kind of like their minds can be ripened from moment to moment to moment. And the process of doing that is available to just the enlightened state of mind. So that is fine. We reaffirm our determination to attain the state of enlightenment in order to be truly beneficial to all sentient beings. And for this purpose, I will listen to a teaching from the Bodhisattva's way of life. I will study it, I will contemplate, and I will meditate on that. The Shokran Guju Gonga, Guju Gonga, and it will be checked the subject in Niba, Nyongmong, Bongway, Gachela, Gyoami, Rikbalas.
Sumba shombe cheto ane loy top ke ko res kalsana loy top ma che ngara do karesna lenyung ge shanga ji ba yinsa ane che ke mo bu chen go ngara do la ta ka che kaso re ganga chen nam da yong to yo ma re nyomo la khap da cha nyomo de nga do pen to za wa ni ne yo ma re te ina yang ngar nyomo la gombe ong ki nyomo la gombe ong ge rang shin ge so so nyomo ge on de ane nyomo ge ba ha mo go ba che 하모가 쟤네 아니 녀모 깨줘야 되네 요구요래 근데 인서 녀모 워터 그거요래 아니 대자마자 아니 디고 뒤지 동동지게 전다 주변에 가요 말이야 그 무주네 초정고도 아니 알아들라 토마메바네 아니 레니베 디반 나서바제 뭐 인서 안고 깬다 채원도 아니 딜라데네 아니 저거 가서 깨냐 뭐 무주 연구요도 카도 될라 다가다 누바께 돼 가고 이면서 아니 될라 나라도 제마다 시시 주제네 아니 삼류 똑지 게 마도 봐이나 야 셈주 차도야 아니 당안에 생겨 저 가서다 저거 아니 저 냠네 고수 봐이네 냠네 탈마지 봐 용해 근데 망보지 용구여도 아니 곧 똑게 그래서 딘누바 공배는 딘누바지 숙청부터 잡아이나 아 란생게 가서 다지 가서다 아니 쳐서 줘야 좀 그러다 라시가 삼르샤 따모고베 토네 아니 녀모가 갑자기 저래 녀모는 뇌조 용되거라 다디또 첨부지 개토바 이나 안디 잔뇨 가서도 녀모 쇼베 쳐도 아니 로이 또 개고레스 수고도 어디 다 개첨부지 버려 때 자war래 대다 제세 다제 다데 뭐숨도 녀바라 뭐좀 제세 다데 쯩미도 생에 또그 매스네 다 간제 가서라 다 간제 셈게 아니 배 누바테네 레신 뇌제 충을라야 초조바 가서데 나제 돈음 대마 좀바 니모
So we're looking at the outline related to verse number 36, and this outline talks about the generation of a powerful state of mind in order to overcome and destroy mental affliction. And so it's kind of like pointing out on the one hand that at the moment we are very much dominated by karma and mental affliction, and that even though we have been well drilled on how there is no benefit to mental affliction whatsoever, but just to the force of habit of that way of thinking, that the mental afflictions arise in our own consciousness. Often they're already there without our even noticing, without our even recognizing them. And so the first point is to really recognize when that mind is starting to be overcome by mental affliction. And that's very, very important. And so kind of like we need to not just kind of do this in a kind of like a, for short-term kind of like intensive practice, but rather to build up the habit of consistency and keep the continuity of our practice very much to the forefront. And so, because understanding that, we are indeed so habituated to the negative karmas that we have accumulated, they're on our system now, and it's kind of like they act as a kind of an obscuring quality. And so that when any kind of conditions are met, then it just triggers the mental affliction. So we we need to increase qualities, particularly those mental factors of mindfulness and alertness, and to be able to really see that we are kind of at a point where it's difficult at the moment to enter into any consistent practice. When we do start practice, we can't bring it to completion and so on. And all of this is that's something which is interfering with our being able to engage in virtue. So it talks about this powerful state of mind that's needed in order to really overcome the mental afflictions. And so that means powerful state of mind is kind of the shorthand for the attitude whereby you automatically apply the antidote to mental affliction. You first of all recognize mental affliction is alive and there in your mind, and then you automatically, naturally apply antidotes to overcome these mental afflictions. So the verse reads, "Therefore, as long as this enemy is not slain with certainty before my very eyes, I shall never give up exerting myself toward that end. Having become angry at someone who caused only slight and short-lived harm, self-important people will not sleep until their enemy is overcome."
다 간제 저기 가서도 녀몽게 구급 다 지금 구급 가서다 다 녀몽 구급 다 지금 용어에 그네 연구여 봤지. 녀몽 구급 그네 연구여 봤던 거라서 하고에도 개체 버렸다 와. 안에 딜라 때네 안에 녀몽 마요라 순접도 제도로 와. 제도 다 되네 임바사 나라서 레뉴게 샤와체 임바 인상 안에 지금 가브레 안에 소소 되바 예베 디기 집에 연구래 사적의 디기 가브레 안에 미데베 동네 디기데 용한 되게 다 디기 중나야 등기 동네 중화 임바나 디 최주베 통계를 배주 땅 도바이나 안에 녀몽 용해도 그거 시라 용하래 다디 최주베 통계를 배주 땅 마도바 제네 안데 녀몽고 온자 줘봐 이마이나 디기데 동네 교소 그래 동네데네 동네 교소 와이바 시에 먹어 봐. 다 디기다 동네 거데 좋아 이마이나 랑게 그도 루다 셈고 돌아 디기다 동네 거데 좋아 이마이나 랑게 남주고 토네 디 가서 최주베 통계를 배주 땅 도바 제네. 제가 이나 아니 다 간제 가서데 녀몽게 고디 갈아가서 캐주고 딱 다디 통계를 배주 땅 마도 맞잖아. 다디 동네 중앙 인바는 디 아니 디게 체제 건가를 미가와 chen 대바이나 아니 또도 동네 무트는 용의 규주베 가서 딜 녀몽 구급 되기도 와. 다 디게 중앙 인바이나 디게 딜 차베 온게 야 무트는 동네 용의 아니 규주도 해줘 용도 와. 다 되네 임자 남주도 가서 다 봐줘 말아줘 가서 돌린 용 되더래. 디기 중앙 인바이나 디게 레게와 사바 좋아래. 다디 다다디 코에 디게 다디 탑에 디게 유튜브에 디 탐색점에 디게 글 유튜브에게 모아지에 아들 라라 디게 중앙에 심지어 탐색에 되나시 디게 중앙에 치마로 용하쇼 오 삼사 삼도다에 아니 디게 개와라 때는 저 딱이 개와 무튼의 주변에 디게서 디게 개와 주변에 좋아하게 동네지 중앙에는 디 미개를 내기 싸바래 미개 와서 싸원이네 싸주면 또 와 삼사게 아니 녀바니에 아니 딜라 때네 아니 그 심지 생겨 내 녀바 된제 싸워 망고 요래 아니 얘들 고쳐 봐쇼 심지 셴발라 된데 그 동네 마용와쇼서 된데 그 잠바데 닝제 공배도 줘야 와다 된데 그 깨라 배주 땅 도바 얘나 대화다 동네 건데 중앙 인바 얘네 녀모게 줄어 주고 말해 다당 알아도 내 당보 와라 된데 그 도나 맞에도 란시게 녀모 줄어 줘대지 안 딜라 때네 다 디반나 소 사대지 용데 그래 때네 다 코안에 타이가 라와 매딩 소치
So initially, it's really important to try to isolate what is it that gives mental affliction an opportunity to arise. And so this is very important to try and therefore kind of protect ourselves beforehand to kind of put measures in place so that we are not overwhelmed by mental affliction. And so kind of like, when we talk about, when we're unhappy or when we have a strong desire and so on, these can be kind of triggers for mental afflictions to arise. And because of the habit of, karma and mental affliction, we can actually be kind of taken away by these kind of initial conditions. And so we have to be able to actually look on happiness and suffering in a totally different light, rather than it being an opportunity for mental affliction to arise. We should see happiness and suffering as an opportunity for Dharma practice, for us to engage in the process of virtue. And so it's a kind of a very, very important to kind of see that. And so if we are able to do that, to whatever extent we are able to do that, it's going to actually really greatly reduce the instance of mental affliction. And that's a very, very important kind of step to take. We know that, when we dislike something, when we have an aversion to something, that's going to, give rise to mental affliction, that leads to mental affliction. So we have to kind of be able to see the opposite, to change things around, using our intelligence to kind of recognize that when happiness or suffering arises, sorry, to use that to engage in spiritual practice. It's very, very important for us to do that, because if when we are kind of like kind of falling prey, as it were, to both suffering on the one hand, whereby then we go into this kind of like litany of negative thinking. We develop the kind of the initial stages of mental affliction until it's full-blown mental affliction in our mind. Likewise, happiness is something that, again, we just increases our desire for more of the same, and increase that attachment to happiness in that sense. So we have to look at, say, happiness as something automatically that has arisen from virtue that I have created in the past, and that triggers the eagerness to engage in the same sort of virtue in the future, because this is a pleasant experience. And not only that, but I want to upgrade the kind of virtue I'm doing so that it leads not just to positive rebirth, but to liberation, to the omniscient state of enlightenment. And may the virtue that I am able to create and the happiness I feel as a result of it be a legacy for all sentient beings. And we rejoice in that kind of thinking, so that's kind of can propel us to repeat that sort of thinking and action again into the future. Suffering, when suffering arises, we should automatically be triggered into the recognition that this arises from a negative karma that I had created in the past. Therefore, that is something I need to deal with very strictly and avoid engaging in such negativity. That all of the suffering that arises upon this, may all the sentient beings who have similar karmas may they not have to experience suffering, and may it ripen upon me. And thereby we're using that suffering not to kowtow to our mental afflictions, but to increase our loving kindness and our compassion. And so it's kind of like when you look at it, there is really no choice in this. We have to completely swap around the responses we have to happiness and suffering, so that we're using them to engage in spiritual practice as described. Because if not, we're only feeding mental affliction, and thereby we are kind of really eradicating all hope for any kind of release from cyclic existence for ourselves.
用这个多，他的我说的第一的，因为上这个第一的，现在应该有说，他的特别第一就做了，按说这个这个说，他这个写了他把周围呢，看的钱有吧？呢，的完了，真的他第一重要的，他第一的特别就了做完了，他东西都被写了个新被拖呢，按那个第一就多几个多少，他把周围的。这讲那个特别就了做过的上，我到第一的了，他点这个第一的他特别就怎么的，他们这特别就做完了，他东西都被写了怎么样把真的讲究个什么新被拖呢，他几个多。第几把人呢？那个他们这特别就了做过多，是不是？我等下讲，大概讲所说的第一中华得了点那样，第一他说的大概这个，他说第三个第一嘛，把这第一第二拉起哇。按第二普通设备第几这准备个就按就跟那啥个多，第二按三六好多吧，结完了，按当然第几中华的，按告诉了他这个，他把他们这前面有了做出来个，按减这个多，第减结完了，当然第几的他，告诉电动第几个，按告诉的推荐差这个多，我都也不了，他东岸的在那些的，东岸中华的，我他东岸都加深没几把钱的，马点把钱钱的。马대바 전에 아니 동해도 뭐죠 봐도 동해도 레냐 봐서 레냐 봐도 녀모 지거든 딱 그거 마세 거서 속에 그 녀모래샤 대자 다 녀모도 마세가 봐도 기바지 따와니는 용사 말이 어디를 거쳐 봐도네 아니 대다 다 녀모스는 레냐 봐서기 뭐도 뒤에도 다 레냐 봐 요에도 녀모 용거도 니 녀모 기바지 녀모 기가 통화 돈에 아니 다가네 심 다다 레냐 오게 동해 중화도 당긴 라바네 시잖아 아니 심지어 생각 동네가 니한테 고쳐봐쇼 삼사전 어디를 제야다 아니 모두네다 레냐바 사주 모두서는 고쳐야다 대체도 아니 강가 쇼주에 튕겨를 봐 자도가 있나 아니 녀모 영상 매봐 찾으라 녀모는 누구도 녀모 야고 말해서 라바서 공개 말했다 녀모도 건데서 연구도 녀모 배 탑쳐봐도가 먼저 기본지 전에 녀모 연구도 또 보지 전에 시에 먹어버렸다. 드니 니가는 요모 연구도 와. 다 드니 니가는 연도 다 드니 니가 대 최주에 통계를 봐 배주 당도 봐이나 에 요모 거기는 가두고도 와. 가두고도 와. 어디 다들 먼저 가서다. 뒤주는 전바다 시신을 주는다 배주 당도 봐 제디. 배주 당도 봐 제디 개쳐버려도 와. 그러다 가담 라마도 송해들에 아니 다 내가 시바 개면 아니 삼루게 달라 동제에서 손에 대대였어. 어디 손에 다 듣고 아니 그 최주에 통계를 저거도 저거도 나 저거 쓰 토바체 제네다 가자 어디를 제네는 요몽게 아니 숙전다 충조대 매버 소토와 제고도 어디를 좀
So, recapping, looking at happiness. When happiness arises, that of course we recognize it as the virtuous cause from which it arises, but also we understand that this is the happiness of cyclic existence. Therefore, it is contaminated happiness. Therefore, it will end. It is finite, and so in that way, we can lose our infatuation with this kind of ephemeral happiness, but also to kind of like look on it too, that if we can't use this situation for benefit, for dharma purposes, then it's going to be kind of co-opted by mental affliction and used to increase the power of mental affliction over us. And so we need to look on this happiness to say, okay, I know this is contaminated happiness, therefore reducing the attachment, the clinging to it, to say I can use this instance of happiness to increase it so that it can dedicate it towards it being the happiness of liberation, that it will be, something that is the happiness of liberation by being able to combine that with wisdom. And so when we have our motivation like that, combining that with wisdom, that can be a cause for the attainment of liberation. And we can even go further than that to say, I want this happiness to become a cause for the omniscient state of enlightenment. And thereby we not only combine it with wisdom, but with the mind of enlightenment, the bodhicitta motivation also. And so therefore you've got a simple moment of happiness that can be transformed into something far more powerful, far more excellent. And so this is the capacity we have, you see, to transform every single moment like this into something that is so much more important. And so a moment of happiness that can be kind of dedicated towards liberation, that can be dedicated towards the state of enlightenment itself. It can be an actual cooperative condition for that. And thereby we are talking about laying down the causes for a permanent state of happiness. Suffering is dealt with in the same way, needs the same input of being able to be mindful enough to understand, okay, this unhappiness is due to the negative cause that created, that is producing this suffering. And that means that kind of the mental affliction was at play at that time, and we could firmly put the focus on the kind of insidious fault of mental affliction in this case. So I am suffering now in this moment. It is down to mental affliction. To really see this as the case, therefore, I must not allow mental affliction to have this control over me in the future and lay down negative causes again so that I experience suffering again in the future. And indeed, like we just stated, that's that moment of suffering, use it as an instance to go, you know, I know that all sentient beings are undergoing similar kind of suffering, and may they not have to experience the ripened result of that. May it ripen upon me now, and use the situation to engage in spiritual practice, increasing one's love, one's closeness to all sentient beings, increasing one's compassion by finding their suffering unbearable and being taken it on for yourself. And so it kind of like, it's so clear that it's crucial for us to understand the process by which mental affliction arises, to kind of really then use our intelligence and the techniques that we have to prevent mental affliction from coming along, from arising. You know, it's not good enough to go, okay, I know what's wrong with mental affliction, I know the faults of mental affliction, blah, blah, blah. We have to do something. And this is the process by which we do it, and don't just leave it as paying lip service to the teaching. And this is where what is key in this, of course, is mindfulness and alertness. These are particular mental factors whose job it is to make you aware of the prevalence or not of mental affliction, the presence or not of mental affliction, and thereby you can actually go and do something about that. It's like you know, the great Kadampa Geshe used to say that I have no particular job to do, but I will stand guard with the spear of mindfulness. And when my mind is relaxed, I relax. When I feel a mental affliction is going to arise, I will be ready with my spear to do the job that's necessary and apply the necessary antidotes.
오다 소소 디지다 동네 근데 좋네 아니 지금 디 조야 값다 아니 디 용야 값 고추온도 아니 딩에 최초에 탱gel을 배주 땅도 봐 지기 삼삼전에 소소 편받다니 아니 디 준데 다른 게 디기다 동네 근데 좋아이네 최초에 탱gel을 배주 땅도 봐 지기 아니 제토바 쇼 제토바데 아니 라마산제 그 징기 랍도수 소데 아까부터 그 뒤집 버전다부터 제전은 간제 지금 랑게 대도 근데잖아 최초에 튕겨를 배주 땅 도바 임바이나 아니 가서 최초에 개기요 말이야 최초에 개기요 말 최초에 개기 근데 작서 가서 최초에 튕겨를 배주 땅 마도바 인자 동네 전에 최초에 개 되게 전에 최초에 개잖아 당하자 어디 개기 와를 수있잖아 아니 다 두고요 말 왔다 되니까 최초에 튕겨를 배주 땅 도바이나 아니 개기요 말이야
Therefore, when either of happiness, suffering arises, we know from the moment, as close to the beginning of those feelings as possible, that this is an opportunity for me to enhance my spiritual practice. That must be the first thought that comes to mind. And so it's kind of like we see both instances as conditions, conducive conditions for practice. And you pray that may I be able to see all instances of happiness and sadness as conditions for spiritual practice. So Guru Devi, please bless me to be able to do this. And you can employ the descending nectar-like meditation in that context as well, and to give you the fortitude to be able to dedicate yourself towards that. And you can understand too, isn't it, that when you have that attitude whereby you are using every instance of either happiness or suffering for spiritual practice, that there can be no obstacles thereafter to your spiritual practice. We can't talk about having no time or conditions and so on for a spiritual practice. That's wonderful, but we have to be aware that if we aren't able to transform our attitude like this to kind of perceive happiness and suffering as conducive conditions for practice, then we are leaving ourselves open to both being obstacles to our spiritual practice, because we get lost in the happiness and we kind of have aversion to the suffering. So we have to be very clear about what to do at the moment happiness arises, the moment suffering arises. And we have to be really dedicated to that. We have to pledge ourselves to be able to take the right attitude. And so when we talk about, having no time to engage in proper spiritual practice, etc., what we are really saying is that we have no time except for the opportunities we give to mental affliction. Because if we're able to engage in the transformation of our attitude towards happiness and suffering as described, you'll find actually that you have lots of time, loads of time to engage in your spiritual practice, and you will be more open-minded, you will be more relaxed, you will sleep better, your food will taste better, because you are reducing. When you start reducing the time you give to mental affliction, you're reducing the influence that mental affliction has over us. It's remarkable how much time you have. Because you only then see how much you were dominated by mental affliction previously.
Dish to it, do your mare, a shopping late to the Tacha Kawakawa. Do you mango never chat over that? They get the Legashita knew the Drossade. Legashita knew the Drossade. Oh, and when it done Louis dance Semilla, Casara independence or Ramachuna, and do you mango your ditch? Carine Chetway, you think. Meaning the Geshe, Kugab do you Kalasoene, do you Tamasoene, do you Karine, do you Radit? And did you dig a Tamja and Shola Beju down to you get? Did you try my much? What did you want to do? Daddy, what a Kanja Marazu, what a Beju down to Aina.
So when we live with the habit of mental affliction, we don't even recognize the amount of time that we have wasted just pondering through a mentally afflicted kind of way of thinking. And so it's kind of like we really have wasted so much time like this, but we don't even see it like that. But when we are, not giving mental affliction that same opportunity, because now we are using the instances, whatever arises in life, to engage in spiritual practice, it just transforms the amount of time that you have for everything. And that it's just it's quite remarkable, that and so, like, you have then the time for doing whatever you want to do, cooking, shopping, and so on. You reduce actually the work of having to deal with mental affliction all the time, or live with mental affliction all the time, and that you have both the mental and physical freedom of body and mind, and that so because you're using that time for the Dharma, and it's no longer being wasted.
And Kali Java in there, and choose to watch. Chiche chose Jules, the Chiche chose Judas, and a Nomo beg Shamado Badoya, and a Nomo Duke Chola Dotu and a touch your Jessica. Church Jessica, Church yes, the Nomo Shamado Madoa, and then Delia Tare, and they on the Madoa, they on the Duege, they on the Dutuege, Walla Droid, and Church Jessica.
So, when we are talking like this, we're saying we're using whatever we have, whatever arises for Dharma purposes to establish the Dharma habit of thinking. And, you might talk about, is that really spiritual practice? Is that really Dharma practice? Well, what you are engaged in essence, is preventing from the mental afflictions from arising and from holding sway over your life. And that is the essence of Dharma practice.
Mi kari lamla malabla che jigido che jigimbo kari lamla keba kaya yomare ina che chosu doa gogu doa ta tigaso nyomola kapde jagaji gogu doa.
So you might talk about reading a book and so on. Is that spiritual practice? Not if your mind is overcome by mental affliction. It's not. So it might anything you do it might look like the practitioner might look like engaging in spiritual practice, but in fact, if you are not actually doing the job of opposing mental affliction, then you are not engaged in spiritual practice. And by the same token, spiritual practice is defined by one's opposition to mental affliction.
In a chat and a chota dog mandos and a Nomoge Nomo Due Gula Dodo, Nomoge Shamat Dodo. Tita, Nomo Shamat and a chat and a chamaro. Recite your mantra at Chipare.
So whether one is prostrating or reciting mantra, it might look like one is engaged in spiritual practice, but whether the mind is on the prostration or on the mantra is questionable. Maybe it's actually, dominated by mental affliction, and as such, you can't call that activity a spiritual activity at all.
Oh, Miss called Chuba Yabore, and Kadi Yabuchigre, called Com Jagre, oh, Miss de la Lagre, Terra, kind chicken chicken, chin by Inanata, Chokai. That me chicken mingly yore, man, the Chemare. That me can lamna malana, so Nomola Capitan and Dogodona. What that when a church had there, what that? Church had there, what that did it. Then they was a church manoa chase, Nomonga Capitan and Dogodue. And Nomon do a tablet Dogodue. What that did? Dogodona, Chumanoa chatter. Did Dogodona? That rang the church is not there. Mingaltana Madana, church is not there.
So we have a person who may really look the part, who seems to be in the seen themselves as a good practitioner. They engage in constant praying. They are a very good meditator and so on. But when it comes to the 8 worldly concerns, that might out them as a complete and utter fake. They may be simply doing what they're doing for reputation, to gain a name for themselves, and as such, they are caught up in that mental affliction rather than opposing mental affliction. So, in brief, if you want to guarantee that the Dharma you are doing is unmistakable, it then is centered on opposing the mental afflictions. That's all it has to do. That's the only qualification for it to be a good spiritual practice. So we should always be aware of that.
제마치도 아는 사제 고란 게 아니 젠다 다 리추얼 슈베 갑라 젠다 페그레서 렌존 젠다 페체 아니 남주도 15제 장마소에서 남겨서 말해 마저 검자리 슈에서와 다 디니까 젠다 연구에서 장마소에 윈자 페 답에 인도 가버려 수에서 아니 공게 안데수 공바시는 다들 게데 문에 쳐라 친도 치모도 공바시하고 다 젠다 레그레서 제가 이번에 못 해봤다 오 다들 직대 추계를 탈라 바가간 torjene ani simshu bare jenda lede be thala khan de ro ba tangma yo mare ande za de kala pha damba sanje jaga lu du chen shiro wa pha damba sanje ani khong ge ken oho be ge lungba na la nyamlen ba jikden chuje khala thala to tungende ani gishi ben kum je jongso songade jikden chuje khala thala to bares
So in the graduated path teachings, it tells gives the account of Geshe Ben Gungen, who was a very sincere practitioner and constantly analyzing his actions to ask were they in harmony with spirit, with the Dharma or not. He's kind of very, very kind of mindful in that regard. On this particular day, he was informed that his sponsor was coming to visit, and so normally his place of practice wasn't the cleanest. It was getting quite dusty because he was so just dedicated to his practice. But he began to clean his altar, offering clean water bowls, and started dusting the place around, and then sitting quietly, waiting for the sponsor to come, when he suddenly, regarded everything around and trying to say, why is it that I'm cleaning, in fact, here today? And it struck him that the only reason he engaged in the dusting and the cleaning was that his sponsor was coming. And he immediately considered this to be part of the 8 worldly concerns, just trying to, impress or give some sort of false impression to the sponsor. And as a result, he automatically just picked up a pile of the dust that he had collected and flung it over everything in the room again. So that when the sponsor did arrive, he found a very dusty, untidy looking, unclean place of practice. At the same time, far away was the great practitioner Padampa Sengye, who through his clairvoyance saw this and proclaimed that there was a genuine practitioner in Tibet who has been flinging dust today, in reference to Geshe Ben Gungen.
He threw
the dust of he threw the dust into the mouth of the 8 worldly concerns.
What did that is or what? That was a Lamrim thoughts, Changa Insa, because the Chigde Chige on the Dova, city on the Chimber, city on the Chimari. 최선의 예봐도 개와 치마 배제 고고요 봐. 근데 기부 중요이나 뭔들 하다 미고 마주를 좋아. 고고요 봐. 디스메바나 체디 온도 치마의 최마이 바차도 봐. 뭐 최마이 바차나 갈래자는 영어래도 왔다. 당고잖아. 어디래? 아니 지대 치마 배제 뭔들 고마치나 아니 거의 되게 교래마다 탑에 교도고면도 와. 탑에 교도와라. 아니 가서다 가자자 코알라 견도 때네 코알다 다되고 로게네 코알라 예바죠 연중 때네 안텔 칸도고 로게네 돈이도 베셔라고 스베토는 고고도 와. 디는 탑에 교도고도 와. 다 탐제 개배 줄라 줘발라 다 돈이도 베셔라 갈라 심지어 탐제도 산제 공부되는 걸로 된대 지금 스베토는 아니 개와 지금 고고도 와. 아니 대중안에 탐제 개배 줄라 줘고도 와. 와다 네가 그거 먼저 신베토네. 다디가 라레가야 임바 인상. 아니 개와 근데 주바 임바 있네 개와 주베티 체디 시황도 만들어 지금 최제 온도 만들어 전 아니 자 아니 먼저 하다 거 원도 지바 있네 대야 코에 줄라 줘고도 디조 디체도 많이 조 타바 아 타바 나네 아니 탐제 개배 줄라 줘도 발라 다 자주고서 돈이 또 셔라 중간에 야보래 마주와 있네 쥐마 천제가 심베톤에 고고도 와다 디가 그 심베톤에 아니 다 가자 간투도 그 냠에 제고 들에도 와 그래서 뭐든 네가 그가 가서 기부 중호 등 전부 세가 되가 아니 꿀는 것도 안에 샤네 딱 이제 최남다지 정도 뭐요 근데 제국도 다 랑게 냠래 제쳐도 뒤에서도 뭐 불려 버려 와
So just as we have recognized many ways in which we can engage in spiritual practice, likewise, there are many ways in which what we do can be the opposite of spiritual practice. So yes, particularly, we must be aware of the extent to which, if any, there is a connection between what we're doing and the 8 worldly concerns. Because as we have found out in the Lam Rim, when we go through this topic, if your action is contaminated by the 8 worldly concerns, then you're only doing what you're doing for the sake of this life. And that doesn't even count as spiritual practice. Remember, even the being of smaller capacity has to have a motivation to attain a positive future rebirth in the future as a human being or as a celestial being. So they're going beyond just this life. They're at least thinking of future life. So if you are in any way contaminated by the 8 worldly concerns in what you do, it's only for the sake of this life, and it is completely anti-dharma. So it's kind of very important, we recognize this, very important. Recognize also, the capacities of that of the smaller, moderate, and greater capacity beings. These are determined by the motivations with which they have to practice. And as we have found out, the being of smaller capacities, motivation is to attain a positive rebirth in a fortunate life as a human being or as a celestial being. So that's the kind of very least motivation, smallest motivation you can have as a spiritual practitioner. Then you go beyond that to want to attain liberation from the whole cyclic existence itself, that process of birth and death. And by recognizing, the default of cyclic existence, it being in the nature of suffering, developing a sense of renunciation, wanting definite emergence from that, and then striving for that with that motivation. So that's the medium or moderate capacity being. And then beyond that, again, is to go, this is not enough. I have to take into account the fact that just like me, all sentient beings are in the same boat. I must develop a state of mind which is determined to kind of release all those sentient beings from their suffering and place them into every happiness. And that is the enlightened attitude, the mind of enlightenment. And that is what demarcates one as a Mahayana or greater capacity being. And so to be able to kind of like engage in one practice like that is kind of very important, that we know the difference between the motivations. The actions can look the same, and they are differentiated on the basis of motivation. And so kind of like our virtue that we engage is initially We must be absolutely sure that it is not contaminated by the 8 worldly concerns, that it is at least dedicated towards a fortunate rebirth. Better again, if it's combined with wisdom to attain the goal of liberation, if it's combined, that wisdom as well as combined with the mind of enlightenment, so that one attains the goal of the omniscient state of enlightenment. And even if we're kind of operating at kind of an artificial level of kind of those mindsets, that is the kind of way to go for now.
What did that the and the Kansa Shambato, Miss Shambato, or Yamlet Chigu to Chimundo, to get more Maria. Ta Ran, Nangba Yin, take what Chimbo Yin, love to the day, Ran, did a tumba you go to Yumudo, Chavacheti, get Chimbo, and how don't do that can judge, how don't do, and the cows Papa Chashawine, Chashawine, what Bayuki Liu Nalola, the Bayuki Liu Nalola Carsana. 당가저 먼저그 저 바유 마대마이나 뇽을 깨그랬어. 뇽을 깨봐이나 라레 누그레 셴레 누그레스. 라지 니가 맞지바 소그레스. 왔다 라지미 안디야 그 뒤지 통도 좀 맞지 말해. 모두는 맞지베 규투구도 가서 뭐여 봐. 규투구도 가서. 어디 손에 당가저 저 안데네 인바 인사 데데가 가서다 당가저 저 가서다 당가저 저 당가저 저 가서다 뇽몬디 뭐쳐 봤잖아. 뒤좀 좀배쳐도 가서 다초 멍분에 삼로다는 애들 랑게 생기 누밖에 그래 스톱 깨고랬어. 뒤께네 아니 뇽 아니 봐 가서 쳐보 요바데 충중도 매버서도 같이 그랬어. 로아 저거랬어. 로아다 대단한 진실 다게 다 뇽 봐. 대고숨도 녀바도 맞좀 대세도 다 깨와 될 뇽 쇼발을 좀 깨지게면서 다 뇽 쇼에 저도 뒤주 해야 마셔 같이 그랬어. 뒤줄 해야 마셔 지도서 다 되게 라바니시 랑게 되게 좋은 동네 좋은 되게 녀몽이 시와도 맞았지. 녀몽게 녀몽 온도 도트에게 아니 줄을 배주 당도 같이 어디에잖아. 어디에잖아. 계지자 미도와 대바치고 그랬어. 죽고도 어디에.
So, when we talk about the spiritual practice, it's not for us to determine whether somebody else is a good or bad or indifferent practitioner. It's not our business. It's really for us to concentrate on our own practice, to ask ourselves the hard question: is what I am doing spiritual practice? Am I continually doing, in harmony with the Dharma? And so I am Buddhist, I'm a Mahayanist, therefore I should act like one. And that's where it counts. And so it's kind of like really to understand it, like this chapter is on conscientiousness, to understand that if I haven't got that sense of conscientiousness, I'm really opening the door to mental affliction. It's as simple as that I have to be more aware, and that they're kind of like, and that if that's the case, if I lack this conscientiousness, therefore allowing mental affliction to take control, that is going to harm me, that is going to harm others. That's the only job that mental affliction has. And so I kind of have to recognize that and to understand that if I don't do something about this, it is going to be a continuous state of affairs. And so I need to recognize mental affliction when it arises, and thereafter I need to do something to overcome mental affliction. And to do that, I need to be able to come at it from many different directions. This is what they talk about, having this powerful mindset that is determined to destroy mental affliction. So it's talking about a really comprehensive approach. And when we talk about that, we talk about just like, we have looked at in taking all instances of happiness and suffering as prompts to engage in spiritual practice, thereby not allowing opportunity for mental affliction at all. And so this is the way we do it. So it's kind of saying here in the verse that for as long as I recognize this enemy of mental affliction, really seeing it directly right in my face, and it is not overcome, for that, until that is continuing on, I will never for one moment give up opposing mental affliction. I will never kind of turn my back on that situation. So that is where we talk about, using moments of happiness, moments of sadness to automatically engage in spiritual practice.
다른 것도 말해서 그 배다 잘 중고도 안 가려도 직전나 아니 내가 지금 내가 지금 레시 아니 그래서 내가 충주 지금 배나 직년바 샤바 유네다 야나 지금 수술을 지 갈차바네 교주 잡아네 갈차바네 근데 되게 직 충주 지금 잡아네 들어 맞서 밖에 어디 되고 여봐도 못 좋은데 야 띵네 아니 샘 띵네 컨트롤 제네 아니 컨센 제네 다들 갑자기 자에게 아니 가서도 나제 또 남라 자대 맞춰 봐도 어떤 되게 컨트롤 수정 못 되는데 아니 되게 자대 매번 소마소거도 아니 니 투자 마요 탑시 먹고 다야 도서 먹고 다야 되게 배수 지기도 왔어 다 되게 지금 요나 다 녀몽데 딱 말아도 내가 탐제 용사 세대이나 체라 저만은 딱 이제 산제 고마 마도 봐도 내가 탐제 용사겠다 아니 그 자와자도 인도 다 khoshom바 가르치는 배수 제고 말했다 다디 맞아 봐이나 답변 쉬고 저기 다 가자 가서래 다 가자 저기 내세 말롱교 차되기도 와 내세 말롱교 차되기도 다 된대 그 저기 내가 괜춘주 내가 지금 너가 거저 배디라 매버 소에 지도 거저 배주 먹부자 조소 먹부 땅에 지기도 왔어 다 차상의 용사의 녀몽 돈의 연구도 왔대 그가 용사 녀몽 다 녀몽 정말 같이 배주 제고 말했어 당문에 사무실 당교 여봐 이나 다 네가라 삼을단 매버 소고도 왔어 뒤좀나 강가 매버 차도고도 왔어 내가 지금 강가 매버 차도고도 왔어 어디 수고도 와 어디 또 dom쳐버려도 와
So then it uses the example in the verse when talking about in the worldly sense, if somebody creates some small harm through criticizing or disparaging or using a harsh speech, then another person can become so offended that somebody who is kind of, as I say in the verse, self-important, arrogant type, they can become so offended that they will stop at nothing until they get revenge. So as it says here, they will not sleep until their enemy is overcome. They will use everything in their power. They will blow so much money and so much engage in so much expense just to get their own back on that person. So if they are putting in so much money, then look at me in the situation where I've recognized my enemy clearly, squarely, whereby they are completely, the mental affliction is that which has caused me every kind of harm, not just in this life, but going back to beginning's time and until I attain the state of enlightenment. There is no greater enemy. And so why isn't it I'm not doing something about that? Why isn't it I'm not dedicated to destroying that enemy? And so it's kind of like I have to do something about it. If I can think clearly, unless I'm really mentally, effective, if I'm thinking clearly, I can see that mental affliction is this absolutely damaging, destroying. Therefore, I really have to do something to completely eradicate this.
그래도 아까 말해서 세딜라 이바이네 세디 아니 지금 동에 탐제 용사들 녀몽게 상 권내랑소라 용되거다 라 녀몽게 상화도 맞춰버려라 셈페 바베보다 시대체 내되거든 녀몽게 자도 안내 두고면도 와 세디게 동네네 쟤네 다가자 토마 매번에 다다 보도 아니 세딜라제 다도 녀몽들 갑자기 짜마도 못주네 또 못주네다 이 상화도 좋다 상화도 친전에 애니 동에 나서봐지 용되다 용되게 도왔다 네가 뭔가 가르쳐도 녀몽 온기 좋아 녀몽 온거 용되게 요래 right? Pena chachana dana ngado corona warriors ke yongri asana ngozo lockdown chete kasana ngozo phungbuti ong yongora phungbuti garitaso nyongora den yongore nyomo pana phungbuti meba chasare ganga de nyomo ong yongdegi to yongdegi da lungu zambole na magtu da nyongda chungsa kimza chine chesa gega ga ba nyongda ganga nyomo ong 용되거든. 녀몽도 좋은데 용라도 좋은 것도 와다. 다 녀몽도 매봐이나 다 용만 먼저 잠리 시대 쓰는데 문에 전에 시대 쓰는데 녀몽 매봐 맞아봐도 시대 차이 여봐다. 까지 녀몽 시대에 쏘고 거는 녀몽을 감대 짜고다. 녀몽은 녀봤던 거 녀몽은 녀몽 맞아봐도 시대 용다 거라 용도. 용다 뭐도 다 데려도 어디래.
So all the harm that has occurred to us in this life, just if we take it in this life, and that all the harm that will come to us until we attain a state of enlightenment is down to all the actions motivated by mental affliction. So mental affliction is at the heart of all the unease, this unhappiness, suffering in our lives. That and we can't have, if we have, without mental afflictions, we can have peace of mind. With mental affliction, there can be no peace of mind. And this kind of disturbance in the mind is continuous. And so it's kind of that which is the kind of like the heart of all suffering that we have to deal with. The whole variety of suffering that we experience is down to mental affliction. So even like look at the coronavirus, the havoc that it's causing all around the world. But it's due to the fact that we have this contaminated aggregate of body that can be affected by a virus. And that in itself is arisen because of mental affliction. So it's at the heart of that as well. And so it's kind of like every conflict that arises, from domestic violence to societal unease to international conflicts, is again sourced from mental affliction. No doubt about it. It's all too clear for us. And so, you can talk all you like about world peace, but unless we can eradicate mental affliction, we can't even talk genuinely about world peace. Because once mental affliction is there can be no peace.
World peace forget. Pasha 김사지게 peace 용하고 말와. 김사지게 family peace 용도고 말와. 녀몽어도 존이 되다나 family peace 가르쳐 그래. And world peace 다른 뭐 계산와.
So yes, you can forget about world peace, and that even domestic peace is unattainable if mental affliction is to the fore.
어디를 다 반자 저 남시나 녀몽라 교제 통 녀몽게 교연 통에 아니 녀몽라 갑대 자야지 고초서나 아니 고서 피스 고초바래 녀몽데 당돌래네 녀몽라 연대 때는 저나 피스 용할 거라 요말에 다가서 다 계제 쉐거 피스
So it's as clear as this: if we identify mental affliction as faulty and really oppose mental affliction, this is the beginning of the road to peace. But if we accept mental affliction, we see mental affliction as having positive qualities, then we have forfeited any chance of peace.
다들 인바인사 왔다들 인바인사 다 먼저 내가 교지게 먼저 교지기도서 갑대 숙청보다 들어줘서 먹보다 뒤주 먹보다 두고이나 다 디가 녀다 강가 중사게 교조 녀모들라 먼저 가르치는 갑대 짜투고 요 말에 다들 저와 첨부절에도 와 다 왔다디 냐바도 다가자 정가라서 셈을 샤네다 배전 제들에도 와
So the key point is saying that, it's not just, we need to really, for the time being and for all time, oppose mental affliction, because it has proven to be the cause of all harm, all unease and all suffering that we have ever experienced. And so therefore, why isn't it that we're really not doing everything we possibly can to completely uproot it, to eradicate it?
다 니와 녀모 보면 까젤라 쪼르 미리발라 숨자 녀모 쇼르니베 고와 녀모 쇼르니바서 가서 고와 고싱 디 가젤라 저 미자와 놈은 쇼베 체도 좀베 편유 내가 놈은 쇼베에서 좋아라 좀 가지 봐고 저 sabcha 숨자.
So the next main headline or outline is the in order to overcome mental affliction, we may have to engage in austerities and hardships, but it is not correct that we should become despondent because of that. This has three subheadings. One is that when we understand that we have the capacity to overcome and destroy mental affliction, then there is no place for despondency. Number two is that we understanding the benefits of effort, of enthusiastic effort in order to overcome mental affliction. And three, the reasoning that effort that we should put effort into the actual actions of overcoming a mental affliction.
是的，他感觉这个这个sabcha 숨냐는 소다 그래서 다 너무 뽕뉴바 이미데 뽕뉴고 문도나 아니 거 깔래자를 촐라로 와. 답시 매바 이나 또거 아니 데데고 뽕뉴고 여바데 가서 다 거투야 뽕뉴고 여 뽕뉴에 뽕에 여바데 아니 디 가젤라 데데 이바이제 디 체도 배전 지엘라 아니 가서 다 셈중 말했어 지금 말했어 다딜라야 디 쇼바 이나 소소 팬도 게 매바 이나 그 배전 제 쳐요 말아 너무 쇼베 체도 좀 말아 아니 배유 매바 이나 그 배유 데다 여봐 랑에 문에 자네게 다 가서 가서다 다 지금 디기 푸수 소바지 용 두고 유도 아까 좀 말아 배유 여봐 다 되네 이바자 오다 되네 이바자 좀 말아 아니 다 배전 잡아 다좀 제도와 아까 그 좀제 야 비다고 좀 해봐라 갈래잖아 쳐요 말아 왔다 됐잖아 subject 수고 돈에 다 가자 가서 어디서 제시 정도도 다 당보들 가서다 너무 좁아 가서 좀 누벼서 고싱 다 시고레스 고싱 대 가젤라 아니 저 미자와들라 자왈래 랑시 치외 동네 교회 녀몽다 랑시 치외 동네 교회 녀몽다 용어는 가세 냉기 쇼바 되어봐야 다도 천지법에 동네 캐스는 대마 주바 치족 제발 미제나 미제나 다도 동네 군지 조조바 랑신 장의 신좀 달라딩 동네 자차 조조 관계장 이제 길로 미줄 매주고서.
So these outlines are talking about the capacity that we have to overcome our mental affliction. So this is the first question, really, isn't it? If we ask the question, are we able to do anything about our mental affliction? If the answer is no, then there's no point in putting any effort in, is there? But here we maintain that we actually, yes, have the capacity to overcome our mental afflictions. And so therefore it kind of, we can see that the benefits of putting effort in makes sense, that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, as it were. There's an actual positive goal to be attained by putting in the effort to overcome mental affliction, and knowing that we have the capacity to overcome mental affliction. And so therefore there's no need to feel downhearted or despondent about any kind of efforts or problems that you might meet along the way. And so it's kind of like there's when we see the benefits of a course of action, it gives us good reason to put in the effort towards that goal. And so the next two verses deal with the first of those subheadings, which is then understanding the capacity we have to overcome mental affliction. There is no need to be despondent regarding any hardships. So verse number 37 and 38. And if while engaged in a violent battle, vigorously desiring to conquer those whose disturbing conceptions will naturally bring them suffering and death, men disregard the pain of being pierced by spears and arrows and will not withdraw until the day is won, then what need to mention that I should not be faint-hearted and slothful, even if I am caused many hundreds of sufferings, when now I strive to definitely overcome my natural enemies, these disturbing conceptions, which are the constant source of my misery.
중에 들레들의 용도도 도와 다들 그 매바 마소라 매바 책임도 와 거기에다 제도 용되기도 와 용되기도 와다 간장 나라도 탐에 자스인데 뭐지 파 매바 마소라 니마지 매바 차주로 그라 거기에 담아 치주래 그 매바 차주로 와 차주로 와 이나양 아니 되게 탐에 자디 아니 매바 소에 치도다 배준 제네 다가자 깔래 잡저 뒤쳐도 아니 락자 담마다 쇠네 아니 매바 소답 지고 열어 배준 지고 열어 봐. 딱 어제 배준 제나 맞잖아 니마지 되게 자디 매바 차주고 열어 봐. 그 시주고 봐. 시주고 봐. 다들이 이나야 어제 배준 제나 매바 소답 지기도 왔어. 수고다. 되는서 마세 장서다 그 담에 어제도 마세 장 랑신기 치외 동가와 주여서 다 녀모제게 기부 먹보다 다 기부 뭐 저거 당가서 잡을래 다 도당 다가로 다 유머스다 대다 다 마잡살아 친네 다 마가 롭종 때 조선 먹보다는 아니 유머 나세 유머라서 다 마잡살게 사제들 유머 때가 다 파서 마잡이 전에 간나 내기 파르보다 배준 전에 다 무트네 아니 쇼바도 디 소소 갑대데 매버 소에치다 야 다다 동라 소베다가 초자 잡아서 다 나소바지 다 배주 땅에 다 가자 다 내가서 다 초자 누바치 보실 때는 여러분다 소베서 천재 포베 동에 어디게 배주 땅에 아니 소소라야 아니 지금 내가 요구 여러분 다 내가 중화 되게 아니 캐도 세네 당도라네 아니 바로베 조베도도 다 소소 자디 매버 소에 되는도 내 마주고 봐도 아니 친행자가 말을 봤어. 마 샤샤가 말을 봐. 미제나 다 근데 지금 해봐나 땅아서 뒤다 정말 찾아 용사기. 다 아니 뒤에 뒤도 뒤다도 아니 동네 군지 줄줄 봐. 동네 탐색에 다 같이 제보다 보디. 또 용사 잡고디. 라신게 자다. 그러 그래서 깨다 찾아 자차죠 말이야. 그 라신게 자차도 다. 거의 뭐지 담에 어자데 거의 깨다 전에야 자저 봐 년에 교회 요구도 와 다들 뭐지 화 인이 말이야 라신게 다른 예배에서 다 용어 좀에 가서 좀 되배에서 까제다 좀 되네 아니 들라 용어 그 갑대 잡에 깔라 다 소소라 달라 지들 중요한 소소라 지 가서 지금 가서다 지금 강에 그래 중앙 있나야 중으로 댕대 값 다 지금 차장라 소바 아니 대검라 소바 근데 다 동에 그래 중앙 동에 자자기 교주와 관계 장 이체벌 다 근데 중앙에 소소 다 이슈면 당에 투사 말에 샤샤 길루가 미주벌 자디 쇼말라 좀벌 그래서 좀벌 제라 매지 매주고 다 자디 좀벌라 아니 가서 다 삼롱 문에 당주 유게 지바이나 아니 디 자디 좀발라다 배주 제국으로 와서 시험으로 왔어. 탐에가 마세바 이네 자디 마세바네 코 란신기 시종에 지라 먼저 뒤체도 깔려 먹부잖아. 소소를 천자다. 소소 쏘를 내가 여바 이네 내가 들 마세바잖아. 배주 지기도 왔어. 당문에 전에 가서 랑게 자이 때와 다 매바 쇼야라 아니 그 지가서 저거도 와서 차와라서 왔는데 강에 그저 전에 당도 렌 마도에 레몬도 왔어. 렌 거에 레도 왔어. 렌나 아니 좀 전도 왔어. 와도 숨고도 와. 어디래?
So this verse talks about or these verses talk about the contrast between the overcoming of our external enemy as opposed to the enemy of the mental afflictions. So kind of like here, it says in the verse, and if while engaged in a violent battle, vigorously desiring to conquer those whose disturbing conceptions will naturally bring them to death. So it's kind of saying here, in the course of an ancient kind of combat, you had on the battlefield enemies engaging in really intense fighting in order to obviously kill their opponent. And so it's kind of saying you have this person engaged in that. So their enemy is not killed, but in fact will at some point anyway will die due to its own causes, the causes of suffering that lead to death. And so it's kind of like, when they go into battle against such an opponent, they are willing to willingly accept all the hardships of being wounded, of being pierced by weapons and all that, and will even go into kind of like great danger to their own lives and won't ever take a step backwards until they overcome their enemy. And so it's kind of saying here, if we look at that in contrast to the mental afflictions, the mental affliction that won't die of its own accord, that will continuously cause us problems and has led to all of the suffering at all times for us, this of both ourselves and others, this enemy of the mental afflictions, that we sense now is the time for us to take on whatever hardships ourselves that we need in order to overcome, if we desire to overcome the mental afflictions, be it hunger or thirst or heat or cold or whatever of the hundreds and thousands of sufferings that we might encounter, that we should be willing to do so. And so we have to really vow to ourselves that we're not going to tolerate any kind of faint-heartedness or laziness along this way, because I have to be able to say, I have to ask the question, why isn't it that I am putting in the required effort to overcome such an implacable enemy as the mental afflictions?
Rata nonju chingxia samsa ta tende re mondo ga samsa ta ngo chue de ko ga sra nyomong ge jabde chama yo ma de jabde chama me cha de ta ga so re ta ga je je ngara so mong be ong ge ra xiangwa de chima de ma de ko le jabde ge chama yo ma de ani ko ne ba ba shi ge ge de pen ba zawa ni ne me de ge cha de de ani ko ngune ngo ji chue ba yin ba yin na ta ko xiangwa de jue de ta pe sa sha samsa chi 다 레모도 삼사 답에 시부지 논주 전부 친샤 다 논주데 그 살찌기는 말이야 다 토마메 반나 단다 보던 논주 치는 용 말이야 다 단도 이네 소소 리빠지 dim마도 봐 이나 아니 무튼의 논주도 줘야게 다 가자 양 용되기로 왔다 다래 밀리 톱 안디나네 산제게 땜바데 제네 아니 지금 다 팀비디 녀모 ngo트에 국업 여바딜라 모두 ngo트 받제네 아니 녀모라 다 가자자 슈첨보도 충다도 매와서다 좀 맞아봐 이나 아니 양조 디나시 국업 제 연구를 해서나 배제라와 가보러 와 단대지 배제 제마도나 다 단대 배제 제도 봐이나 아니 무트네 야다 남주 야다 다 가자 그 셰라게 droda 잡았잖아. 셰라 비다고 좀만에 용도 뭐라. 안 된다들 셰라 뜬게 아니 가서라다 가서라다 가서데 람든 지금 게 똥바 샤제 도바스로 좀 마주와이나 또 가버려. 녀모 락바라다 녀모 참원에 차시 잡아 어제 난게 돼. 똥바 바시래도 와. 똥바 바시다 녀모 락바데 녀모 교연이 봐. 좀다 용서가 나는 용거래. 이내 녀몽게 짜와 다지 마릭바레 스게 녀보 다메 도베 샤라브레스 아니 녀몽게 깨당게 림바티게 냠뇽게 또네 아니 워테니 데데데 거 엔딜라 아니 림바데데 데데서 람 차사와 람 고림 마노와 다데 아니 지금 레 당보와치네 저탈 산제 고마 마토게 바도 에데 랑게 림바 아니 고림 마초 아자마 아니 고림 마초 왔다 마투 받잖아 아니 차상와 여되게 점박이 슝 바시죠 다 덴데지 단데 제베 고급 딜랑 어저 와지 천지 제마도나 안티 락반의 쇼스나 단다지 갈아간서 딩주지 소마도가 이나 개와 치마 벤제를 딘나이 딩 워트도 봐 디 샹와도 마도베 단단에 지 가서래 지금 떡지 개마도가 이나 단다가 누바데 당면도 왔다 되네 누바 슉 쳐다지나 갈아간삼질 내봐 이나 아니 개와 치마래 아니 가서데 녀몽 샹와도 마도베 누바지 때도 이나 아니 되네 상다 줘야 와 좀 그러와
So, what is our prerogative then? That we, first of all, look upon the way in which we are dominated by mental affliction now. Because we don't understand the full faultiness of mental affliction, that we are so habituated to that way of thinking that it doesn't dawn on us that there is an alternative. And so we have to kind of really, get into the nitty-gritty of how we are dominated ourselves from mental affliction, and to kind of like really, see instances where, we've been engaged in mental afflictive thinking, whereby we see the mental affliction as somehow beneficial. It's a kind of ignorance in itself. It's not to be able to see mental affliction for what it truly is. And but at this point, having listened, having looked through the graduated path teachings, we should really see it as something that is kind of like really quite shocking to us, that we have, oh my goodness, this has opened my eyes. I realize how destructive now, how mental affliction can only be harmful. There is no saving grace to mental affliction whatsoever. So it's kind of like really understand also that mental affliction is not validated in any way. It's not backed up by valid reasoning. The only reason it's prevalent in our system is through habit. And so it can only harm. So we must consider from here on in, if I fall under the influence of mental affliction, actually it's a huge mistake on my part. You must actually, see how damaging that sort of failure is in our whole spiritual kind of life. So we have to kind of make it like big like that in our lives, so that we can generate the necessary energy to oppose it. And so it's kind of like to never fall under the influence of mental affliction. And so it's kind of like we must check at every level, that we have the coarse mental afflictions, then we have the more subtle levels of mind. We need to be able to see the false in every way, to get down to this ignorance of self-grasping of the true entity, and to realize how that is the very root cause, a root mental affliction from which all the others arise, and to be determined to develop the particular wisdom that can directly oppose that. And so to actually get to know the path, the complete path, the unmistaken path. The path is set out in the right order, and to kind of like really learn this in the way that only the Buddha has outlined, and to kind of say, this is kind of like an absolutely priceless opportunity I have here. You know, not only being born into this human existence, but to actually have met with these teachings, have met with the Dharma like this, in the way it's presented like this. It's an amazing opportunity. If I were to let this slip out of my hands, it would be an unqualified disaster. And so I've got to use this opportunity now to the best of my ability. And that means that I am laying down the causes. I'm dealing with happiness and suffering to turn it towards the Dharma, to lay down causes so that I get a fortunate rebirth, get better and better and better as my lives go on.
밀리터 산제게 때마다체 아니 집에 퇴삼 지에다 아니 지금 산제게 지가서도 출루고 조다 준비 심바디 다 심바잡라 참마샤와체 강도도 냠네 제네 아니 가라간자 지금 등주 수에네 중요하다 산제 고마 탑도나 양슈리다 디 마타와 임바 이나야 깨와 치마 벤젤레야 아니 벨 람디다 제투에 람디 냠네 제투에 딱도도 녀몽 껴 통도에 녀모 파엘라 아니 개전 지금 게 개와 치마 편제를 못은 이제 저통 게 등주 마용 봐도 어저 해야 줘야 매버려 다디 등주 중앙에 간삼서는 아고 란신게 녀몽게 딱가자 저게 녀몽게 갑대자야 란신게 줘도 배전 매버져 줘고 란신게 다 배전을 맞아봐져 줘도 중앙에 임바이나 아니 그 나라도 등이 사버려 이 맞은 거 봐도 다른 어저 가서다 kindergarten 소리래. 가서도 다 kindergarten 소리가 충북 충중 얘기 장되게 소리지. 다른 것도 땡도 가요 말. TB 신고 열때 가요 말. 다야 갈래 감삼래네. 지금 근데 주바 죽지 중리 잡아들래는 어느 소소리 이게 뒤시 봐 이게 땅시 봐 이게 로시 봐. 근데 지금 차소 차베 소리때 아니 소소 갈래 감삼게 지금 가서도 냠내 제네. 아니 개와 치마 반절래. 아니 저기 뒤 냠내 제투에게 뒤 숙제 투에게 근데 누가지 중앙이나 때 말아서 갈라가서 다다도 말아서 가서래 저기 집이 신교대 냠내를 약보 자네 다다 소속에 누가때는 먼저 가서 냠아 줘봐 다다 가서 퇴중비 시작하고 갈라 집이 신교 열때 아니 신도 버려 다들 가서 양내 양도 삼로 따네 아니 뒤 배제전에 아니 지금 삼중의 시작 개투와 삼중의 시작 때는 저는 랑기 잡아래 이 시럽도 랑기 시럽 잡아래. 아니 삼종이 녀바띠 아니 곰 잡네. 아니 곰종이 시럽 깨봐 제대다. 아니 똑바줄에 깨스는데 저기 열봐. 뭐다 되잖아. 강통도게 예전 맞잖아. 단다 여봐지 가자잖아 놔두고 그래. 단다데 최종의 시럽거나 준비 신고 열때 최종의 시럽래. 랑도 말이 현도 그래. 어디서 어다데 토상 고소 야마되어 저래 뒤토를 다가제 배준 제디 개치 버려도 So
we have attained this precious human rebirth. We have met with the Dharma. We have met with qualified teachers, and we have an understanding to some extent of what the Dharma means. But you know, this isn't enough. That we have to make sure that we actually really turn that understanding into practice, integrating it into our lives, into the very way that we are thinking, and to gain the confidence in the path that will really stand to us in our future lives. Because after all, this is what our temporary step is going to be, isn't it? To actually guarantee that we gain the same opportunities that we have happened upon in this life. And so here, it's very important to kind of like understand, keep reaffirming the faultiness of mental fiction, how it should have no place in our thinking, in our lives, and that we are developing as kind of the process of thought whereby when any hint of mental affliction is arising, we have a naturally arising automatic response to oppose that, to apply antidote thinking straight away. It's kind of part and parcel of who we are. And that this is important, because then you've brought it down deeper, you have more confidence in the way you're living your life. It's like a small child. the very beginning outset, they have no proficiency with language. But then as they grow up, get more education at 12 and so on, they can have more flexibility or comprehensive understanding of how to use language to communicate what's in their minds and so on. We have to see ourselves in this way to kind of like understand here we are laying down the imprints carefully, deliberately to lead us to a better future life, to meet with the Dharma again, to have a precious human life, to meet with qualified teachers, to meet with the unmistaken, correctly ordered and complete path. Again, that's very, very important that we build up this kind of habit of thinking now. And so, we start off with being aware that just the wisdom arising from learning, which is gaining, the data, the information, is not enough, because that's still other powered information. We need to bring that home, to own that for ourselves through the wisdom arising from contemplation. And then we deepen that into realization through the wisdom arising from meditation. And so it's very important that we have these kind of understand these levels by which we can assimilate what the key issues are, and that wisdom arising from learning is only kind of surface level understanding. It's other power. It's something somebody else has told us this is a good idea. We have to make it a good idea for ourselves by contemplating that. It means analyzing the information, using reason, so that we have enough confidence in the information to actually integrate that into all our thinking, into our lives, and deepen it further then and through the wisdom arising from meditation. So it's important that we do the best we can in this regard, and to make sure that we are, on the one hand, seeing mental affliction as being 100% faulty, as having no kind of place in our thinking, in our speaking, or in our actions, and also that we are not just leaving the Dharma at the level of lip service, but actually we are integrating it into our lives, making a difference.
누가 배나 소소 김다나로 임바이네 녀모 맞죠 빨리 녀보시에 두고도 가는 지도 녀모 계속 나오면 도와 녀모 기도 간가 용고도 와 간가 용고도 와다 디가 그 교회디가 그거 못 쳐봤잖아 아니 그 녀모 먹이월라 돌아 아니 디제 가자 지금 말아줘 녀 배나 말아줘 지금 최근 로중 더 제뉴가 지는 녀모 야고 말했어 뭐저 간가 시길 때 얘네 녀모 끼어와다도 근데 끼어도 뭐저 맞죠 봐이나 아 점점 어서 낭매 쇼르고도 와 안들에 예자 녀모 되긴 라바네 시제 기기 중에 녀모 끼고도 동해진에 녀모 끼고도 딱 녀모 용사도 고망보시도 왔다 되게 간가 하고베 돈에 아니 녀모 그거 맞다 왔다 근데 치고도 어디다 개쳐버려도 와 어디 개쳐버려도 왔다 되게 이마 예자 간가 최주에 통계를 배주 땅도 뭐 제거를 해서 그 내가 전부 심리도 와
So happiness or unhappiness, it's often the case, that mental affliction can be present in both. And that, somebody who kind of looks at us in a negative way or using negative speech, immediately our mind is disturbed and we enter into mental afflictive thinking. And it's kind of like here, we have to understand that when we are in that state of mind, we have already forfeited any power we have over our situation. And that's kind of like what we have to really concentrate on is not allowing mental affliction to arise. It's not just enough to know that, mental affliction is not good. That's very clear. But we have to be able to understand that mental affliction can be present when we're happy. Mental affliction can be present when we're suffering. And we have to be able to recognize very, very clearly that there are many doors through which mental affliction can get in. And so we have to really, the key point is to be able to transform all situations into the Dharma path, to bring them onto the path. This is really the key issue. And that means that, we are recognizing, first of all, where mental affliction could possibly arise, and we're putting in place ways of dealing with that, antidotes to that, right? Ways of opposing that before it has any control over us.
가자 너무 차상 깨사도 남자 간도 제대로라고 말해. 다 너무 맞게 거는 거기 샘도스 마데시시 좀 마데시시 영향 갈 오다 너무 깨지 지기도 삼네. 아니 오다 너무 깨와라 랑레 누그레 셴레 누그레 와랑지 니가 내가 지고 다 너무도 말죠. 다 내가 다 연하면들 다디 고급라기도 삼들 남자 대세가 주도 와잖아요. 막 감다운 제들이다. 감다운 제들.
So we have to understand that, once mental affliction has arisen, kind of comes more full-blown, it's very difficult to deal with it at that point. So we have to become really expert at diagnosing mental affliction very early. So we're feeling any sense of discomfort, unease, anything like that, we have to recognize, oh, danger, mental affliction could well arise now. And if that does arise, it's going to be harmful to me, it's going to be harmful for others. I must not give mental affliction this opportunity. And so you really focus on that point, on really calming down, calming the mind down. So we leave it there for today.
다 남준의 시잖아. 나는 가서 라고 뛴들 또 두배 뭐 세다 왔지. 또 뭐 세다 와라 와대 어디 있다. 라고 지워들 딱 간자 저 년중도 섬을지다. 다 토스제는 원남에 봐도 딱 간자 저 동네에 당시지. 그러다 간자 딱 간자 저 동네 유메 켜봐 요구요래. 아니 교회 동네 딱 간자 잡아도 저 동네를 맞대 버려. 다 잡아도 저 동네 잡아도 저 동네도 맞대 거 봐도 딱 간자 저 맞대 거 봐도 딱 간자 저 가서를 딱 간자 저 무트네 딱 간자 동네 나서 봐지 용해 임바다 다 타쳐 버려. 근데 이바자 근데 이바자 딱 간자 코알에 녀봐 줘 녀종지 섬르다. 아니 데데게 녀베 로티니 로티니 다 간자 지금 가서를 근데 랑게 저 뺨마 답게질 교수 삼자자 아니 지난 거 출 건데 지금 유대는 도와서 다 뒤상 요마를 쓰면 커다 쳐서 섬다 섬다 아니 데데 예베 로티 아니 가서를 다 간자 저 님의 기과질 교수 삼자자 아니 심지어 탐제도 산제 고반이 원유 마탄 지금도 토바치기 삼사된데 로직에 데데그 두바테 답에 김과질을 주네 근데 반대자가 라마도 뭐 다게 지워보면서 가르치고 구수도 연구도 zet도 데려서대 담비 가서 배 니가 수면서 때려서 산제 고반 마도 제수 송소소 어떻게 고바시
And so then to bring our minds again to the central figure and the conclusion and dissolution, we start to prepare the Lotus Sun and Moon Disc mandala seat at our own crown by, first of all, reflecting on renunciation, on the way in which cyclic existence is that in the nature of suffering, from the peak of cyclic existence down to the hell without respite. It is imbued by suffering, change, and in particular, pervasive suffering. How this pervasive suffering induces the other two, how it is marked, kind of like it is the mark of cyclic existence in a way, that it means that suffering is always prevalent there, and that we develop that sense of wanting to gain definite emergence from this state of affairs, this renunciation, by recognizing how inconducive it is to everything. And so we develop this renunciation mindset. From that arises the lotus mandala seat. And then reflecting on how all inner and outer phenomena, like any objective existence, really are just imputed by thought. We center on that, and from that arises the sun, this mandala seat. And knowing that must work towards enlightenment in order to benefit all sentient beings, bringing forth that mindset of in mind of enlightenment itself, bringing forth the moon disk mandala seed. And then, oh glorious and precious Root Guru, come take your lotus and you see placed here on my crown, keep me safe in your kindness, bestow on me the attainments of body, spirit, and mind. Having recited this thrice, the first time the figure moves from the space in front, and at the end of the second recitation comes to sit on the seat that we have prepared, and at the end of the third we have the certainty that the Buddha will remain there until we ourselves attain enlightenment, and we rejoice in that fact.
Yala Tumba Mendeta Chevata, Siketu Kaine Kawa Yomari, what I Yala Tumba Mendeta Job, Puna Chaza, what the church of Tamada such. And such position rules from Idangura and Mandela and the Antaya Mesta, Yala Tumba Mendeta Chapina, what did it do? And because of the Takaja, she saw some of what she in that, Juma invited to do and some of the other Rangi Yala Tumba Mendeta Job, what then, and the Lamatua will be sheni. 아니 가서도 두길에 대화 동바데 동바데 대던 뉴스에 이시 계속서 어디에 고파자도는 양무여 어디는자 아니 되네 다다기네 시주 고바세는다 년종 고바세 년종을 로티니 아니 상인이 때마다 계절 교수 성사자 되네 지난번 주 근데 줘봐이네 이든 좀 유사 요 말이 서도 하도도 심지 탐정기도 산제 고바죠 나 쓰는데 가봐 세주네 아니 나 많이 봤다가랑 갈 셈샤네 근데 가셔 가서 다가랑 갈 셈쳐 데데가 로티 데데가 또 가셔 가서 예배 로다가라 아니 님의 뭐 약간 왔다 가서데 님가마 답제게 때도 어때 드레스냐서 선생님네 다 심지어 탐제게도 산제 고반 요원도 맞다나 탐은 토바 지기 섭사주 고바시 아니 데데 예배 아니 두바티니 데데 두바티 아니 가서데 나한테 뭐 이야기 같이 줘서 때문에 받아서 라마를 뭐 다른 얘기가 되면서 그렇지 뭐 고소도 연구를 잡아서 근데 수대 잡을 랑게 집어내 마주네 저 담배 가서 봐쇼 니베가 담배 가서 패 니베 가서 쇼 수배 가서 때도 쉬는 산제 고마마도 뭐 제수 송수 선자 가고
So then we offer the 7-limbed practices and the mandala offering at this point. And if we have time, also we can see at having offered these practices and the mandala that the actual Buddha on our crown shows this display of pleasure, of being pleased with our sincerity, and from that then bliss arises voidness and the wisdom of abiding in bliss and voidness. The non-dual bliss and voidness. If one has the time, it's very good to do that at that point as well. And then we start to kind of establish the moon, lotus, sun, and moon disk at our own heart center for the coming of the Buddha there. And again, through looking into the suffering, the sense of renunciation, seeing the nature of suffering of all psychic existence, contemplating on that, and from that arises itself the mind. That from that mind arises the lotus mandala seed, and through reflecting on how all outer and inner phenomena lack any objective existence, and even at the atomical level, and are merely imputed by thought, how the I, looking into this, when I look for that I, not finding it in the body mind, arriving at that point of the mere negation of the object of negation, just pausing at that moment, from that arises the sun disk mandala seat. And then the determination, and that personal determination to I will be the one to attain enlightenment for the benefit of all living beings. The mind of enlightenment itself giving rise to the moon disk mandala seed. And again, we recite the invocation prayer thrice. O glorious and precious Lord Guru, come take the lotus and seed placed here of my heart, keep me safe in your kindness, bestow on me the attainments of body, spirit, and mind. At the end of the first, the figure begins the journey down through our crown chakra into the central channel. And then at the end of the second, arrives at our pre-prepared seat at the heart. And at the end of the third, we have the certainty that they will remain until we attain the state of enlightenment, and we rejoice in that fact.
And they got a dodgy cover thing about Chakachi Kajan. And the Tagoto, the Betsanga diet or monument harmonious diet or monument diet or monument yes, that must be quite a commercial. Then I need to Jamaica and Sunga, Arabas and Nati, Arabas and Nati, Arabas and Nati, Sunga. Then they yet my head to Shaman is what they use some cottage. And the ranking Ningi, Yusu. And to be Lama Shaja singing cool, Kusum to la say, oh, don't ever train. Rangi Chibone can't take a ball of say train. And Toma member departed the Kabato and the Kajo, Takan Soju, Majo, and Misawacha. So Tamatsu was yet, nothing is a Lotala Soba Takanja. So Tabe Tobata Kawa, Chajusima Lavata Kawa, Sanga Taseta Kawa, Patamala Maguba, Kimbo the Lovela Maguba, Toasamba, who just sort of never late, but not told it Tabajas of quality, you don't go so chichibat, but Chanchi Taba Chunsu, sons of what in the Kumbashe. The Hanicha Lugan Naza sing with Tune, and the Chunshi, Kubanuba Lasoba, the Gundika Marcham, and Saluntile Gunta Tanja Marcham, and the Kanan Tanja Tawara Jampashi Chat for Yamushu, sons of Kumbashe.
And so then the petals of the lotus fold over the figure and joined at the tips by a white pipe from Semivajra. And that package then is surrounded by three mantras: the mantra of the name mantra of Shakyamuni Buddha in a clockwise direction, the mantra of Manjushri in an anti-clockwise direction, and the mantra of dependent origination in a clockwise direction. From the figure within, then powerful, countless white light rays begin to emanate from the heart center, permeating through the lotus and through every aspect, every atom of our bodies, from the tip of the crown to the soles of the feet, in purifying all negativities that have accumulated since the beginning of this time. All negativities associated with the engaging in the 10 non-virtues: killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, harsh speech, divisive speech, lying, and idle gossip, covetousness, malicious intent, and wrong view. All the vows that we have broken from the Pratimaksha, the Bodhisattva, and Tantric vows, all naturally occurring negativities, and all those actions prescribed by the Buddha, all situations in which we have engaged in the negativity ourselves, have compelled others to engage in or rejoiced in the doing of, and all negativities such as disrespect for our parents, right up to having disrespect for our guru, and that all sickness and ill health and disease of the body, all mental issues that we have, all imbalances in our channels, winds and drops, and 4 elements, all these kind of are completely purified, rebalanced, and that the problem of our engaging in ordinary appearance being the single most destructive obstacle to our quickly attaining enlightenment, we deal with that by seeing everything in its pure aspect,
어떤 공부시 아니 되는 아까 저 탐에게 나셔도 괜찮지 탐에 나지 괜찮지 참 가나타자 답하는 잡아지 차도 잡아 줬어. 그런 신도 저 논의 일랭게 라마샤자스가 꾸들 현지 지금 어느 소소리들 라마샤자스가 꾸를 주소 삼사자. 소소 신도 저 셈데 일랭 라마샤자스가 꾸들 현지 지금 소소 셈데 라마샤자스가 꾸를 주소. 란게 류가 예순다 라마샤자스가 구종도 뭐 예매 주소 삼사자. 문에 걸어 주소 삼사자. 디 동바제 동배 대화 야돈 예수의 시켜서 자. 아란 내사게 내디야 내가 교원 탐제 된 라마샤자 생기게 답에서도 주소 선고 맞죠.
And so then, we have through the combination of my own most subtle wind acting as the main or substantial cause, together with the body of the Buddha acting as the cooperative conditions, my own body is transformed into the enlightened body of the Buddha. And through the combination of my own most subtle mind acting as the substantial cause, together with the mind of the Buddha acting as the cooperative conditions, my own mind is transformed into the enlightened mind of a Buddha. I see then now my own body, speech, and mind are inseparable from the body, speech, and mind of the Buddha. I see that as a display of emptiness, from that arises bliss, and I abide in the wisdom of non-dual bliss and voidness. And the place that I am in also is transformed of all faults into the abode of celestial being.
라마샤자스게 구수동고 예매 주바 대 투갈래 아니 라마샤자스게 빠도 매버 줬네 아니 감속이 선제 당자로 퍼와다가 안 대다 당자 라마샤자스 구수동고 예매 주소 대다가 내 대다 당자 내가 견 당자 전에 라마샤자스게 답에시도 주소 섬산차 감속 선제 당자 라마샤자스 구를 주바다 구수동고 예매 주바 대체도랑이 개와 가도 두고 중국 소소저 유대다 다섬레서 대 동바자 동배 대화자 근데도 무슨 이시 계속 수고하셔.
And then from my own body, speech, and mind being inseparable from the body, speech, and mind of an enlightened being, I send out light rays from my own heart, equal in number to all the beings in all the realms of existence. And as it enters into those realms and touches them, they are completely transformed of all fault and arise as fully enlightened beings. And that their place of where they are also is transformed of all fault and is transformed into the pure realm of an enlightened being. And so I see all of what has occurred, the leading of all these sentient beings to the state of enlightenment, the virtue that has facilitated that, and myself as the agent of that virtue, is completely empty of any objective existence, as merely imputed by thought. And just abiding in that thought, I see the emptiness combining with the bliss, and I abide in the wisdom of non-dual bliss and boldness.
어떤 것이 뭐다 심지 단절도 산재 고마 두고 있어 다들이 좀 심지 단절 산재가 살았고 또다 가고 다 다들이 돈다 때문에 중수 소소 가고 다다 매바 이제 살아 문에들 라라 가고 요래 이래야 다들이 삼로 땅바디 긴능시 좀 문에 보라 뉴원도 주베 아니 가서 다 튕겨서 개견도 되네 다 되게 라발리시 아니 상에 근데 중앙 인바이네 대다 단자 아니 가서 산지 비조 아니 자주고 쓰다 돈이 또 싫어하게 아니 그런 튕겨 와서 소화됐죠.
And so that I rejoice in the whole what has occurred here. I've led all sentient beings to that state of enlightenment. This has happened today. I completely rejoice. This is so meaningful. I also understand that it is happening at the level of imagination, just aspiring towards this. And so I say that, but I still make a sincere dedication that it will quickly be made manifest, just in the way that I have imagined it. And that in order to do that, may I be able to transform all conditions in my life into conducive conditions for practice. Just as we have been discussing during the teaching, all of it that is good and bad that occurs in my life, may I immediately see it as a conducive condition to engage in spiritual practice. You are of Loktashavara, great treasure of compassion, not aimed at true existence. I'm a Geshe, master of flawless wisdom. As well as Vajrapani, destroyer of hordes of demons without exception. Tsongkhapa, crown, jewel of the sages of the land of snows. Losang Drakpa at your feet and make requests.